Ever feel like following Canadian politics just means picking a side, liberal or conservative, but not really getting what each side actually stands
I
for?
know what you mean.
It's like they're not just arguing about like this policy or that, but about what Canada is even supposed to be, what direction we're headed, and that's what we're diving into today.
Welcome to Dansplain. I'm Edward.
And I'm Lily.
So on today's deep dive, we're going deep on liberals versus conservatives in Canada, pulling out the most important insights from our analysis. Dansplain, episode 45, Liberals versus Conservatives in Canada. A comprehensive analysis. Basically going way beyond just the headlines to give you a real grasp of the ideas that drive these two big parties
Right, the core beliefs that shape their whole approach.
and how those beliefs actually play out in the real world. Not just the theory, but the actual laws they pass, their track records. We'll look at the good and the bad of each approach.
Because it's never as simple as one side's perfect. Exactly. And we'll put it all in context. The whole political landscape that these parties operate in, it's like a crash course.
Your shortcut to really understanding Canadian politics.
So, Lily, where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think what's interesting right away is that liberals and conservatives have completely different philosophies about how to run Canada. The analysis puts liberals as center, but maybe a little left of center.
Okay, so not like totally socialist, but definitely believing a strong role for government.
Right. Our analysis says a core belief for them is using the government to make things more equal and fair for everyone.
Social justice, yeah. Like with taxes, the idea that people who earn more should pay a bigger percentage, and then that money goes into all those social programs Canadians rely on.
Like healthcare.
Education, yeah. And for liberals, it's not just about money, but about Canada as a diverse place, a multicultural place, and that's a good thing.
Strength and diversity. And protecting the environment is huge for them, too. They're all about inclusivity, making sure everyone feels welcome and has opportunities.
And a lot of those ideas, they really came to define Canada under some big-name liberal leaders. You can't talk about the liberal vision without talking about Pierre Trudeau.
Absolutely. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, his push for a bilingual Canada, those things totally changed how we see ourselves as Canadians.
Yeah, huge changes. And more recently, our analysis points out Justin Trudeau's legalization of cannabis and his government's various climate policies as examples.
Continuing that focus on social progress and the environment.
Now, on the flip side, the Conservatives, the analysis has them center right on the spectrum.
Definitely a different worldview.
Like, fundamentally different. Their core beliefs, our analysis says, really prioritize free markets, meaning less government messing around with the economy.
Right. And they're big on balanced budgets, keeping government spending under control, and lowering taxes as the path to a stronger economy.
And often, with that economic vision, comes a focus on law and order.
What some might call traditional values.
Yeah, and they talk a lot about decentralization, giving more power to the provinces, less power concentrated in the federal government. And like the Liberals, there are some really significant conservative figures who've shaped what the party stands for.
Brian Mulroney's a big one. He pushed through NAFTA, the free trade agreement with the U.S.
A huge change for the Canadian economy, still debated today. He also brought in the GST, which was, well, not super popular at the time.
To say the least.
And then you have Stephen Harper, who was all about those tax cuts, really cemented that as a core conservative principle.
And he brought in tougher crime laws. His handling of the 2008 financial crisis is another part of their story. Like, we're the steady hands on the wheel when things get rough.
Yeah.
So two very different visions for Canada.
But then things get a little messy, don't they? Because governing isn't just about ideals. You have to deal with the real world. So with the Liberals, you have this idea of government stepping in to do good.
But our analysis points out some things that make you go, that's interesting. Like they buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Wait, the party that's all about the environment, they buy an oil pipeline.
Billions of dollars for oil infrastructure. Makes you wonder what their calculations were.
Right, because it doesn't seem to fit neatly. So what's the explanation?
Well, maybe it shows that governing is just more complicated. You have your ideal, your vision, but then you also have energy security, keeping the whole country happy, not just one region.
So maybe trying to balance competing needs.
Could be. Our analysis also points out that some liberal governments have done things like freezing public sector wages.
Which doesn't seem very helping the little guy.
Right. Why would a party known for its focus on social programs do that?
I guess it shows even if you believe in a strong safety net, you still have to manage the money.
And sometimes that means tough choices, maybe choices that don't perfectly match your ideology.
Okay, so the liberals aren't always perfectly aligned with their own ideas. What about the conservatives? Where do they deviate from what they preach?
Well, they're all about free markets, limited government. But then, under Harper, they bring in the universal child care benefit.
Which is the government giving money to families, a very active role for the state. So, how do they justify that?
Right, it seems like a contradiction. Maybe it was just a popular policy, something voters really liked.
Or maybe they found a way to fit it into their own worldview, like, this is how we support families, which is a conservative value.
Interesting point. It's like even parties with strong ideologies can be pragmatic sometimes.
Okay, so the conservatives can be flexible too. The analysis also talks about their use of omnibus bills.
These giant bills that lump a ton of different stuff together.
And they do this a lot, even though they talk about decentralization, giving provinces more power. But these omnibus bills are all about the federal government exerting its power.
Right, so how does that square up?
I guess it shows the difference between the theory and the reality of governing. Sometimes maybe you want to get things done quickly.
Or maybe you just want more control. It makes us look closer, not just at what they say, but at what they actually do. So, switching gears a bit, let's talk about track records. Liberals, historically, have had a pretty impressive run, haven't they?
Yeah, like amazingly successful. Our analysis says they've been in power for something like 70% of Canada's history.
Wow, that's a lot. Must be doing something right.
To stay in power that long, you have to be delivering things that resonate with voters decade after decade.
What are some of the big wins that keep them winning?
Well, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that's a huge part of Canadian identity now, and that was pure Trudeau.
And making Canada officially multicultural, also Trudeau. Jean Chrétien, he got Canada out of debt, even had budget surpluses for a while.
And he kept us out of the Iraq War, which a lot of Canadians were happy about.
More recently, you have Justin Trudeau legalizing cannabis,
Mm.
and that Canada Child Benefit that's been credited with really reducing child poverty.
They've also won 3 elections in a row, 2015, 2019, 2021. And people initially gave them pretty good marks for how they handled the COVID pandemic.
So they seem to have this ability to adapt to stay relevant to a lot of different Canadians.
But the Conservatives have had their moments too, haven't they?
For sure. While they haven't been in power as much overall, when they are in charge, they get things done. Brian Mulroney, he made that free trade agreement with the U.S.,
Huge impact on our economy, good or bad, depending on who you ask.
and then the GST, which was definitely controversial, but it's still here.
Under Stephen Harper, Canada got through that 2008 financial crisis in relatively good shape compared to a lot of other countries. And he cut the GST, which he'd promised to do.
The analysis also points out that the Conservatives have been making gains lately under Pierre Poilievre. Polls were looking good for them in 2023, 2024.
Like a possible changing of the guard.
Maybe. It shows how Canadian politics is always shifting. It's never static. Okay, so we've looked at how these parties think, their track records. But what about the pros and cons of each approach? Like, what are the good and bad things that come with each ideology?
For the Liberals, a big plus is their focus on social safety nets, things like universal health care.
They've also been strong advocates for LGBTQ rights and other progressive causes. These are things that matter deeply to a lot of Canadians.
But the analysis also highlights some potential downsides, like they tend to spend more, which can lead to higher debt.
That was especially true during COVID, all that emergency spending.
And we talked about how their actions don't always match their words, like the pipeline versus the climate goals. It makes you wonder about how sustainable their approach is in the long run.
Okay, so with liberals, maybe it's a question of can they keep those promises?
Now, conservatives, they're all about lower taxes, balanced budgets. That appeals to a lot of people.
Right, the idea that government should be careful with our money and their focus on free trade, that's generally seen as a good thing for businesses.
But there are criticisms too, like what happens if you cut spending too much?
Does that lead to more inequality? Do vital services suffer?
The analysis also brings up their social conservatism. That might turn off some voters, especially in a country as diverse as Canada.
So it's like, who benefits from their policies and who might get left behind? It's a real trade-off. And to really understand the whole picture, we have to remember it's not just a two-party system.
Right, other parties matter too. The NDP, they've never formed a government on their own federally, but they definitely pull the Liberals to the left.
Like with that recent deal on dental care, that wouldn't have happened without the NDP pushing for it.
And the Bloc Québécois, they make sure Quebec's interests are heard, especially on language and culture. It has a national impact, even if they're focused on one province.
Even if they don't win elections, these other parties shape the conversation. And then There are bigger trends in society that affect everything.
Like populism. That's been on the rise, and it seems to be helping the conservatives.
People are frustrated with the economy, feeling like the system isn't working for them, and they're looking for something different.
And you can't ignore the impact of COVID. The liberals spent a lot to keep things afloat, which was popular at first.
But now the conservatives are hammering on the debt, making it a big issue.
It just shows how a big event can totally change the political landscape. Even U.S. politics can have an effect up here, surprisingly.
Our analysis mentions how Trump winning in 2024 actually gave the liberals a little boost in the polls in 2025.
But maybe Canadians were looking at what was happening down there and thinking, we don't want that. It's like, even though we're different countries, what happens down there influences us. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the liberals and conservatives, their different visions for Canada, that's the central tension in our politics.
The liberals, they see government as a force for good, for making progress.
Yeah.
The conservatives, they're more about individual freedom and being careful with money.
The analysis says liberals tend to do well in cities with diverse populations.
And conservatives are strong in the prairies, in rural areas.
But both parties have challenges ahead, like the economy. Housing is so expensive, inflation's still a problem.
And how do you keep up with changing social values? All the diversity in Canada.
And then the global stuff, climate change, all the instability in the world. So what's the big question our listeners should be thinking about?
I think it's this. How will these two different visions, these two different ways of thinking about Canada, affect how we deal with all these problems in the future? It's not just an academic question. It's about what kind of country we want to be.
So much to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of Canadian politics.
We hope it's giving you a clearer picture of what makes liberals and conservatives tick, where they come from, what they want.
Because understanding these basic ideas, these ideologies, it's like the key to unlocking all the political debates we're having as Canadians.
And the choices we make at the ballot box.
If you enjoyed this exploration and want more deep dives like this, be sure to subscribe to Dansplain wherever you get your podcasts. And for more, head over to www.dansplain.xyz. You'll find new episodes, articles, partner products, and more, all to help you understand the world a little better. Until next time.
See you then.